So thank you all for coming. I'm Shiva Subbaraman. I'm the director for the LGBT Center here. And I'm going to invite Charles DeSantis, our Associate Vice President and Chief Benefits Officer, to do the welcome.
Good evening. I'm honored to be here tonight and kind of stunned that it's been 10 years. And I want to, before I introduce President DeGioia, I want to reflect on the amazing enormity of this event, and to look around tonight and see the amount of people that have been engaged with the success we've had with the LGBTQ Center is amazing and overwhelming. There are many people in this audience that were there from day one, and I want to say that I do not miss the 7:45 a.m. meetings we had every day, or the constant looking at data and inviting people in. What I do miss is the community that created and the amount of people that came together to actually do this amazing center and hire Shiva and create this overarching and overwhelming impact for our community. I'm a San Franciscan, and when I came to Georgetown in 2006, it didn't dawn on me that we might need an LGBTQ center. And when Jack charged us all with being part of this, internally I'm like, I don't know that we need that. I've lived in an LGBTQ center every day of my life in San Francisco. And then as we gathered as a community and we peeled back the onion and we continued to meet with faculty, students, staff, external consultants that helped guide us in our internal community, it was so evident that we really needed to create safety, inclusion, and a community for everybody at Georgetown. And by creating the LGBTQ Center and being such a historic creation for Georgetown and for the nation, we actually were able to do that. And so I'm honored to be here. I can't believe it's been 10 years, which means I've been here for 13, which I can't believe either. And I also want to make sure the Tagliabues are recognized for all that they've done for us. And I just want to say thank you very much publicly again and again. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the man behind all this, our president, Jack DeGioia.
Thanks, Charles. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Charles. It's wonderful to be with all of you this afternoon to welcome you to this special gathering to mark the 10th anniversary of our LGBTQ Resource Center. And a year ago, we came together right here in this room to recognize the contributions of so many across our community who have helped to make this center possible and to make a center like this thrive as ours has over the course of this past decade. So to everyone here today, thank you. We're grateful for your presence. This room is filled with people who have demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to our community, to caring for their peers, for their colleagues, their students, and for future generations. And it's through your contributions, your efforts to build a stronger and more inclusive community that we're able to come together today. Just over a decade ago, when we began the search for an inaugural director for this center, we could not have anticipated our fortune in securing the leadership of Shiva Subbaraman, without whom this center would not be the place that it is today. Her impact is without parallel. And over the past decade, through the work of the center, she has nurtured a sense of possibility for so many students, reminding them and providing them affirmation, reminding them that you belong here. In seeking to bring out the very best in each one of our students, she has brought out the very best in all of us. Our conversation today with two leaders in higher education, Dr. Marcia Chatelain and Dr. Dan Porterfield, is a reflection on change, how universities have become the places they are today, and how we can continue to respond to the demands of our time in these years to come. At Georgetown, we are shaped by a tradition. We are shaped by the practices of the academy. Together, these two elements constitute the way of life that characterizes our university. You've already, on other occasions, heard me allude to some of the aspects of our way of life. Our focus on the formation of young people, the responsibilities we have to care for one another, the commitment we have to bringing out the best in one another, and in doing so, finding the very best within ourselves. We're also places of imagination, where we privilege the relentless pursuit of truth and where we seek to serve the common good of our nation. Universities are among our world's oldest institutions, but they are not unchanging. Our way of proceeding, our way of life, refined over centuries, shared across institutions, guides us through moments of challenge and change. Many of us will spend some of our most formative years here. Some of us will spend many years of our adult lives on our campus. All of us are forever members of this community. Time and community work together. It's our work as students, alumni, faculty, and administrators together over many years that forges the sense of stewardship, a responsibility to the values that define our university. It's in this context that we are able to discover new ways of being a university, new roles, new ways of responding, new capacities. A decade ago, we sought to interpret anew our responsibilities to our LGBTQ community. Today, we face new demands, not only here, but across our nation. And these demands seem great at times, insurmountable. But our way of life also offers us hope, a way forward when the challenges seem greatest. Yesterday, Oscar Romero, the late Archbishop of San Salvador, was canonized, declared a Catholic saint. 40 years ago, in 1978, we conferred upon the Archbishop an honorary degree in front of an audience of 5,000 at the same cathedral where he was brutally and tragically murdered 2 years later in a nation on the brink of a civil war. The day of his death, March 24th, 1980, in his final moments, in some of his final words, he implored the members of his congregation to seek out change. I quote, "Dear brothers and sisters, let us look at these matters at this moment in our history with this hope, with this spirit of giving, of sacrifice, and let us do what we can. We can all do something, at least have a sense of understanding." Close quote. Let us do what we can. We can all do something. The first step we must take to create change is to begin. A decade ago, we took one step. This center is something. This community that the center has sustained is something. And because of all of you, it is something wonderful. So I look forward to all that the center will continue to mean and grow to become in our community in the time ahead. I again wish to thank all of you for your presence here today. It's a privilege to be able to be here with you. And now it's my pleasure to invite Shiva to the podium. Shiva?
Thank you, President DeGioia, for your leadership, your generosity of presence. So my task here is to just do a context to introduce Dan and Marcia. Edges That Blur, the title for this event today, is a fragment from a poem by feminist queer poet Adrienne Rich. And I quote, "The body's pain and the pain on the streets are not the same, but you can learn from the edges that blur. O you who love clear edges, more than anything, watch the edges that blur," end quote. Those lines have stayed with me over a decade as marker of the continued fissures and connections between the personal and the political, between us and them, activism and response. This conversation actually began in April 2008 when I first came to campus to interview for this position. And what I learned has stayed. There was student activism, protests, demands that led to the town hall with President DeGioia and the working groups, and then the center. The story is almost apocryphal now. Last year, we observed the 10th anniversary, and intentionally so, of the student-led Out for Change campaign. The center can be seen as the institutional response, or as I like to think of it, the community's answer to the very real anger, fear, concerns of students, faculty, and staff on campus. And this story has played out in many different forms over the course of decades on this campus and across history, from civil rights to anti-Vietnam War protests to anti-apartheid movements to most recently that on slavery, memory, and reconciliation. Student questions, angst, fearlessness, and courage has led the charge. But institutions are not monoliths. Though we often think of it as brick and mortar and abstract forms, institutions are individuals, people in particular locations and spaces. They're evolving and dynamic. They're not just resistant to all demands. They bend, they grow. So part of my purpose in convening this conversation was to interrogate the binary of demand and resistance and to examine the texture. I can't think of anyone better able to talk to this dynamic than Dan and Marcia. Dan was the first person who interviewed me that early morning 10 years ago. And I've been talking to him since then, mostly in my head, in reading his calls to higher ed and in his posts on Facebook. And joining us is Marcia, who has taught us how to make poetry from pain in the streets with her #Ferguson syllabus, her participation in the slavery, memory, and reconciliation work. And my personal favorite, your amazing Muppet communities online. So it is with great pleasure that I turn it over to them.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
Is that your favorite side?
Wait, I wanted the left side. Oh,
Yeah,
no,
that's what I thought.
that's- Take whatever meaning you want out of
Yeah,
that.
so I never get to be on the right.
So, how are you?
Doing great, thank you.
Welcome back to Georgetown. I
Good to
have
be here.
had the pleasure of seeing you at Franklin and Marshall at an Aspen.
We hosted her. We had the whole school come.
That's not
The
true.
whole- No,
They
the
did-
whole
they
school.
did-
It was the whole school that came.
The
on
entire
Thursday.
school came.
No classes were held. She gave a talk. People went nuts. The next day, she went class to class. They went further nuts. If you don't believe that, this guy right here, his name is Christian. He was at F&M. He'll tell you. Go ahead.
And we've seen each other at Aspen events.
Yes.
But I feel like when you are on this campus, you come most alive.
Probably
Because
do.
you are a person who is in the history of this place as a student, as a Hoya parent, as a former administrator, and a former faculty member. And so if we think about what Georgetown was...
Don't forget one more thing.
What's the other one?
Faculty and residence.
Oh, faculty and residence. I know. So me too.
8 years in Copley Hall.
I know, which
Yeah.
is the Lord's
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, we loved it. Just remember, all of you that are dancing in Copley Formal Lounge and having a great time up there, remember there's a family under there. One time I threatened to call DPS. My wife said, "You are a monster. That's horrible. How can you do that to those kids?" Go ahead.
So you have had a long relationship with this institution. And so thinking about the Georgetown that you attended as a student and the Georgetown that you helped bring to this moment in 2008, help us understand these two different places, the consistencies as well as the things that were fundamentally different in those two eras.
Okay, so 79 to 83, and then 08.
Yeah.
And there's all this after. I think that what's coherent that runs through the whole, as President DeGioia said, is an institution committed to a set of core values and commitments. There's Candace. It's so good to see you. I'm just going to keep scanning and keep looking for people. Candace sat in. Remember, her senior year of one of my classes. She came 4 times. She wasn't in the class. It was so cool. And then I recruited her to work at Georgetown. Okay, back to the question. What runs through it is a sense of an institution's identity. And Jack referred to it as a tradition. And a tradition has all these different qualities to it. Values, practices, people, chants, signs, hopes, and silences and failings sometimes. Tradition can be a straitjacket too. So, tradition is a powerful thing, but if it doesn't move, it's a problem. Now, Georgetown's traditions between 79 and 83 and between 2008, some of the words I would use would be that we as an institution cared for the whole person, that we as an institution sought to empower a conversation around faith and meaning in a way that was respectful and inclusive of all, that we stood for academic excellence and a serious commitment to the life of the mind and to inquiry, that we valued being a national institution based in DC with global reach. All that was the same in 79 to 83 as in 08. We were a more pluralistic community by the time we hit 08. Those core values were there. And I think that the response of the university, led by President DeGioia, to the need to create a whole initiative on LGBT life, including the center, grew out of our engagement with a changing world, with the dynamics of social, cultural change in society. And we were lucky that we had a president that had the will and the skill to help an institution use its traditions to respond to a changing world, rather than to fail to respond because of those traditions.
How do you have that conversation with the various stakeholders? Because the person who graduated in 1959 or 49 has a very clear vision of Georgetown that may not be the vision of inclusion that you were trying to put forth in 2008. How do you have those conversations with people who are tethered to what Georgetown may have never been, but the notion of it?
Yeah. Well, of course, listening and with humility and with an openness to changing the thoughts you might have, but and for caring where someone starts from, but not writing them off either, assuming that because somebody's older, then they're somehow not going to want to change. And so I remember very well when we held the town hall meeting in the fall of 2007, where Jack announced to the school that we were going to embark upon an initiative, and he asked Rosemary Kilkenny and me, and then Cal Watson, who I recruited, to lead it. He said we were going to develop the initiative, which wasn't just a center, develop the initiative, not in spite of our Catholic and Jesuit identity, but because of it. What Jack was able to do was to frame the work in a way that was coherent with core values of the institution, because they were coherent. And in fact, and you can just tell me to get off the stage if I don't quote you right. He won't, but I know, but he inside, you think it anyway. Jack invoked the love command from the Gospels. We are called to love one another. It's the highest value of the Gospels. And so how could a Catholic institution committed to sort of gospel vision fail to heed the love command? And so I don't think there's anything that any one person did, except Jack did the most. He was our leader. But the rest of us were sort of followed that lead. And then that lead did open the conversation with alums of a variety of eras and backgrounds who came to this institution at a time when it was less inclusive and when all dimensions of sexual identity were barely talked about. We did something pretty interesting that first year. We wrote a cover story on the Georgetown magazine at the same time that the initiative was happening that I think it was called LGBT at Georgetown, but I can't remember. It was a cover story, and I basically edited the whole thing and interviewed people, and we had a writer, but everything, I felt like I owned that, to tell that story well. We told the stories of different women and men, what it was like to be gay at Georgetown in 1950, 1955, 1960. You put a human face on something, and it's very different than you're just talking at the level of abstraction. Real people talked about how it hurt to be not able to express their identity, to share their whole selves. Or, on the other hand, expressed appreciation for a professor or a staff member or a fellow student who was there and who was welcoming. And so, storytelling is a part of how an institution knows itself. And if we can get ourselves to the point where we're listening to each other and then sharing the stories human to human, some of those seemingly hardened positions become just a little bit more flexible.
It seems like also part of the strategy around student activism is to have a really compelling narrative and use it to galvanize students and to push the institution, and the institution having the capacity to actually listen to those stories. And so when you think about the period of time in which this initiative was taking shape, what are the ways that students were also compelling the process?
Yeah, so there's, I'm getting older, my memory's not what it used to be, but I vaguely remember sort of the following. In the fall of 2007, the police announced the arrest of a student for beating another student and making homophobic comments while doing so. And the arrest occurred a few weeks after the alleged incident. Those charges were dropped, by the way. So when that was announced, the police made this arrest, a lot of people that worked here, including me and certainly Jack, didn't know this had even happened, didn't know what it was about. Nobody in DPS had brought it forward and said this happened. And so there was an understandable concern that the institution, maybe in whatever form, knew about a beating that was homophobic and allegedly homophobic and didn't alert the community. And it was that was a spark. It was an important spark. And students felt that the school was not being transparent about incidents that occurred. And it's a big institution, and so things happen, and it was poor sort of communication. It's kind of like, if in another circumstance, let's just say it's an RA or something, and somebody writes something homophobic on a door, like on a whiteboard. If the RA treats that as graffiti, it's a graffiti problem, that's not right, but they might not know that it's much more than graffiti. They should be bringing that forward to their hall director or whatever. So we then were in a mode of reaction, and students and faculty and staff were angry and in different ways came forward to voice concerns. Rallies, yes, but also private conversations, to say, we gotta do something about this. And so it was in that context then, a couple days of different ways that concerns were raised. The institution had no answer, it didn't know who the student was, except that he was a student. Jack made the decision we needed to have a town hall meeting and announce a more comprehensive approach. And so then this is important. So the student voices were critical in raising the institution's radars, and we need to respond. And again, it was faculty and staff too. But then we announced an initiative, and we worked with a very significant group of student activists who were quite wide-ranging in their perspectives and interests, along with selective faculty and staff members, to create a whole set of working groups that were looking at different things like campus culture, academic life, the possibility of an LGBT resource center. And we composed these committees extremely inclusively. Students were the lead. Whatever the number of people were, about half were students, and Rosemary and I were the co-chairs of the thing. We had a couple of Jesuits, Father Burroughs and Father Gray, who served in it. Cal helped to manage the whole process, and it was quite meaningful. Ellen Henderson is here. I think Ellen might have been on one of the committees as a member of the faculty. And so student voices were very represented. But here's the next big point. These students were meeting once a week, which was great, at some townhouse in Burleith, to figure out how best to work on the different committees. We had a steering committee of the whole thing too. How best to work. And those students were a range of, it was a range of backgrounds and identities identified in different ways ethnically in terms of sexual identity, different ages. I'm not sure they had a ton of overlap in all the other activities they did. It was a very, very inclusive group. And what they did was they sat together every week to start the week on Sunday night and worked out their approach to the week's work, because we were meeting several times a week. And they wanted to get a center. And that's the most important thing I could say. Because if they didn't want to get a center, if what they wanted to do was have protest after protest after protest, they could have done that. But they wanted a center. And that meant they wanted to be part of a process that would necessarily use the full resources of the institution, including several Jesuit priests, several faculty, several senior colleagues. They wanted to get something done. I can't tell you how much I respect that students would raise a principled concern coming out of a set of backgrounds that were disparate with an activist orientation, but fundamentally, they wanted this to work.
Well, let me ask you this, because I think that, we're here celebrating the center, and that is a clear, visible sign of this work. But the two issues that you talked about, I think, are really interesting. The general climate of the institution, as well as some of the academic issues. These are probably the two hardest nuts to crack in terms of institutional change. And so when we think about student protest yielding a center, a program, we can applaud that. But then there's the hard work of the shift of the culture, which I think for some of us in recent days wonder if we are really able to do that. And so how do you then, as an institutional leader who's also very perceptive, how do we get to that in ways that are also meaningful? Because I think that the celebration can sometimes mask the parts of us that feel like the work is so deeply unfinished.
Yeah, well, it is unfinished, so we own that. And I think that process matters, including people at the table and going through a process that allows the full range of considerations to be heard with a mentality of a genuine good faith of getting something done. I think you have to have all that, inclusiveness, all voices, a commitment to getting something done. I wasn't here, so I don't know the details, but a somewhat similar dynamic may well have been in play when the university, led by President DeGioia, created a number of positions in African American studies in different ways. And that too grew out of an engagement with students and faculty. We think about, what are the demands of society today? How do we build an institution that can be a leader in society today? And that necessarily requires institution listening, but also dialogue partners that are willing to make progress. I would say it's steady, generally incremental, with occasional big strides. Right? The LGBT was a big center, was a big stride, and then lots of incremental work that has been led by Shiva and her team over a decade.
Well, let me ask you about when you take the big stride.
Yeah.
As someone who is listening to students, hearing the clarity of their demands, and you also hold some of the keys to the institution, how do you assess when to strike and what it's going to cost you when you make these decisions? Because I think for a lot of students, that deep desire to see the result, but I think sometimes university leadership, sometimes we don't hear from them the transparency that you were talking about. Like, folks, this is going to cost us a whole bunch, but we're still going to do it, or we're afraid to do it. How do you balance that need to be open about what's possible at a given moment?
I had some experience with this here, but then more recently at Franklin and Marshall College, where I served until June. And at Franklin and Marshall, which is a great liberal arts college, so no graduate programs, 2,400 students, about 600 per class. In 2011, when I started working there, we had lots of academic strengths, but what we did not have was any significant inclusiveness in our student body. We had only about 5%, 6% of the student body came from the large category of Pell Grant eligible students in our country. There's a huge amount of talent in that group, and the school was missing it, as were many schools. And so it ended up being, not the first thing I did, but early in my work, build a strategic plan that included tripling our aid budget, shifting to what Georgetown does, which is entirely need-based model, no so-called merit aid, and then building pipelines to schools and programs around the country where students are really being prepared well for success, including the Cristo Rey network, where Jose was our very first Cristo Rey student at at Georgetown.
At Georgetown.
Sorry. And so we built this big thing. It wasn't the only part of an agenda. I think any leader, I would recommend, if you're a leader of an institution, have several agendas, don't have one. So you need to be working to involve the full institution in institutional progress. We were developing a new approach to career services, a 10-year strategy. It was a kind of a real reboot. We were developing a whole approach to student-athlete experience. We were developing a college house system, not a dorm system, in the early stages of that. And we were developing a talent strategy through which we tripled Pell Grant students very quickly. And some people said, it's too fast. Don't triple the Pell Grant students. Like, build heaven and then let the angels in. And I didn't think that was a good strategy. I think it was much better when you're working with students to get the students in and let the students be partners in building the institution. And so that we tripled our Pell Grant population, which meant we tripled our student of color population, which meant we tripled our rural and our immigrant population. But we didn't triple the faculty percentage of faculty of color for another few years.
I was going to get to you at this. So the change happens one way, but where is the infrastructure around to support that change?
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that's interesting about student activism that can deliver tangible results is the gap between that moment and the sustainability of that moment. And I think that this is sometimes what concerns me the most about institutional reaction. Is there investment to make sure that in 20 years, it isn't just a center, but it's a shift in culture, a dynamic approach to diversity, and real ways that we can respond to the questions now about diversity and leadership of the center, trans inclusion, helping create a network of peer institutions that are also making that choice.
Yeah.
So how do you do that part? Since
Well, there's not
you've
one
done
way.
it before.
It's not one way. I'll say that.
Yeah.
But I thought it was we framed our work, what I call the next generation strategy, as a talent strategy. We didn't frame it as a diversity strategy. We were crystal clear.
Is it because people are just done with diversity? I mean, in the sense that, no, and I mean that honestly.
No, because I value diversity.
I know you do.
Yeah.
But, I mean, to just be very honest with you,
I know.
Can we lead on diversity?
I don't know. Inclusion, yes.
Okay.
But if you're in the context of a highly selective school, I believe the most important thing for the students to believe is every single one of them is they are there because of their talent.
Okay.
And I believe it's the second most important thing is for the faculty to look at a class in a changing demographic and not say, why do I have to cope with all these different people from different backgrounds that I don't know? But rather, these are talented kids. This school saw their talent. It's my job to unlock that talent, educate them. And I didn't develop a talent strategy to not do diversity. But what we define talent very clearly. Yep. Saying yes to opportunity, having a vision of why education matters, having the resilience to deal with setbacks and go forward, having good grades in a college prep curriculum. All those factors allowed us to go all around the country to low-income communities and find talent. Just like when you're hiring, those are the kinds of things you look for. When you look for talent. And the faculty, a couple of them said at the very beginning, a couple of them said, I'm quoting one, quote, this isn't really fair, but Dan Porterfield is going to find out that those students of a certain background from a certain place can't do the work here. And in fact, she found out the exact opposite, because 2 years later, we had the retention rates and the grades, and they were the same as or higher for the Pell Grant kids. So the students' achievement academically actually helped to create the culture you're talking about. Their achievement then helped the faculty say, we got to get with it. These kids can do it. Now, we did other things, but we didn't try to build the perfect environment. We tried to get the talent and then let the talent help us create the environment. There's a million things we did for change. I won't go into them all. I do think one thing. You can overdo it by treating low-income kids as precious pieces of pottery that can't be taken out and have their own college unless they're manicured and protected. I really think that if a kid is talented, yes, he or she can benefit from some support, as can upper-income kids. Everybody needs a little something, for sure. An individualized education, responsiveness of the gears of the system to what their particular needs are, yes. But we overdo it sometimes, good, liberal, academic people, when we try to show how great we are by giving these kids that are so-called underprivileged every possible thing as if they can't do it. And it sends a negative message done wrong.
Well,
Quite
since you brought it up, this idea
I'm trying to get it going in here. So,
of benevolence and paternalism, because I think that what we also see when we see these student-driven moments, right, is that students become unpaid consultants for the institution. And that, wow, look at that.
Yeah.
Where were you all in class today?
Yeah.
When I was talking about Western history. But seriously, what does it mean when we have to have that balance of recognizing the creative potential and power of our students, and then that shift to make sure that we're staffed and funded and energized to not exhaust the students? And this is something that sometimes it's about mentorship, but I also wonder how as a leader and as a faculty member, you absorbed some
Yeah.
of that criticism. I don't
Yeah.
know if you remember what happened to the day I came to Franklin Marshall. Do you remember what happened before my talk?
No, what happened?
It was good.
Yeah.
There was a die-in. There was a Black Lives Matter
Yeah.
die-in before my talk. And the students were so polite about it.
yeah.
They said, Professor Chatelain, this isn't disrespectful to you, but we
Yeah.
really want to raise this conversation. And I said, okay, it's more than fine. And I joined them because I didn't want
Yeah.
them to believe that what they were doing was wrong.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there's a conversation that has to happen after everyone
Yeah.
gets up. And so talk to us about the balance, because I'm sure in this moment in 2008, there was
Yeah.
this question about roles and responsibilities.
Yeah, so I've had students say to me before, your job is to make me happy. I was like, I can't do that. I'm sorry. We can listen, we can evolve, we can do new things, and we've done many new things. But I think that we have to also challenge students to be partners in creating the community they want. I don't think they're unpaid consultants. Honestly, I think what they are people shaping the community, the traditions, the culture of the school. We created, our students and the college together, so many different great new resources at Franklin and Marshall College. A first-gen club, a first-gen faculty allies, a program called Next Generation Interns, where we do pay low-income students to go out and have coffee with incoming students and just talk to them. We created some good stuff, but that's different than saying if it wasn't for our benevolence in structuring the perfect environment, they wouldn't succeed. Because that's not actually fair to the students. And so part of community life is giving, yes, contributing, offering your point of view, having something to say. And I think it's everybody's responsibility to help create, the so-called beloved community. Everybody should try to give.
So in thinking about the community that was created in 2008, with all of these forces converging, what kind of model do you want to know that you allowed for other Catholic Jesuit schools?
Yeah.
About entering this particular issue about inclusion and diversity around sexual orientation?
Yeah, so I think that the thing that the institution did together was created a structure around which we could grow, listening to student voices and developing all sorts of new ways to grease the gears of Georgetown University so that LGBT students could feel a sense of belonging. And would it be perfect every day? No, because it's not for anybody. 18 to 22-year-olds are defined by the ups and downs of feeling good or feeling bad, of feeling stressed or feeling happy, of being in or being out. It's a constant dynamic. That's what it is. That's the nature of college education. So we have to create an environment where the students can shape it, not just be shaped by enlightened people like you and me, but rather they shape it together. Now, you got to recruit a great leader, and Shiva is an extraordinary leader. You have to have top support, as you have from Jack, from Todd Olson, from others. In this case, we had a board chair, for goodness sakes, with his spouse, who donated $1 million so that we could have a strong, well-funded center with programming that students could help shape. But the idea that the adults, quote, adults, and I use that term advisedly, are providing everything for the so-called students, it's got to be shared responsibility.
And so in thinking about all the responsibility that's kind of balanced and shared in this type of community, how do we ensure that the model that was set with this center can be replicated across the university?
Well, here's one thing. Paul and Chan donated $1 million to endowment. That means it'll be here in 200 years. If you want to have power, students, seriously, you want to have power, give to the endowment of an institution targeted to the things you value. And you will have power, because that will keep happening, that thing you fund, forever. That's one thing, to create and that's a powerful way to affect institutional culture and make it sustainable over time. I think that another key thing, critical, is the involvement of faculty as well as staff in the work of the center. Can't say that enough. The more faculty take the time to be involved in the whole lives of students, to share experiences and to build bonds of mentorship, the better that thing is, whatever it is. It could be the badminton club, whatever it is. The more the faculty are involved, the better it is for the long-term health of that endeavor. You asked this question earlier about what could Georgetown do to influence other institutions. The power of a great example. That really matters, and that has had an impact. I don't know if there's tons of Jesuit and Catholic institutions or Catholic institutions that have followed Georgetown lead yet, but they will. They will, because this is the right model. It's an educational model, too. Shiva is a profound educator. Where did she go anyway? Did she leave? Oh, there she is. Yeah. She's a profound educator. You listen to the things she says, and it's coming out of this deep grasp of the dynamics of human identity. I remember when we were interviewing, I think I asked a question about Q, about the Q. So A, what is the Q? Do you want it to be questioning? Do you want it to be queer? Do you want it to be something else? Questing. And she said it can be anything, but if you think that questioning is about what am I, that's not it, as I understand it. She said, rather, I think that questioning is how do I live who I am in my social life, my professional life, my family life. That's the questioning. Not what am I, but how am I. I said, wow. So I will say that educators think that way. Those deep, rich questions that you can run with for a long time. And I think that's key to recruit staff for an educational institution that are themselves knowledge creators, thinkers, educators. That works better for the culture. That's part of, I think, sustainability.
As a result of your experience having worked with this, what is the inside information you would give to students, and what did it teach you?
Well, one of the things I'm most grateful for, the personal stories I'm most grateful for, is a student whose name is Julia, who shared something pretty important with me. We had a dinner. It was me. I don't know if Cal, you were there. It was at Peacock. That's my favorite place. And so I brought this group, the whole leadership team. It's 11. They were all the protesters, not the only ones, but they were the leaders of protesting. They were the leaders meeting at the House, and they were the steering committee of the whole thing, all of them. And some were farmed out on the committees. We went to Peacock. Were you there that night? Was that just me, you think?
I was there for a couple.
Yeah, he probably paid too. And Cal was right out of college. So he'd graduated in 2007. He'd turned me down for 2 jobs I offered him. Finally, I found a job he could take, which was to work to help create this, the whole initiative. And so we're out talking, and the student Julia says that she had come out at home over, I think it was right after Thanksgiving we were meeting, over Thanksgiving. And I said, well, how'd it go? She said, oh, it went great. And I said, well, were you surprised? Why did you wait so long? Because she was a senior. She said, well, I wasn't surprised exactly, but I didn't know. So that's why I waited. So I thought about that for about a minute. So I gotta learn from that. At that time, our daughters were something like 6, 5, and 1. Got home at night. I think Karen was asleep. Basement of Copley. Shook her. Said, Karen, wake up, wake up. We gotta start talking about sexual identity more with these kids. We can't let them go until senior year not knowing that we love them, period. We love them whatever they are, whenever they want to tell us whatever, but we're going to tell them a lot, okay? It's like, sure, whatever. So then, of course, we use Disney as the way through. You don't have to have the prince marrying the princess. You can have 2 princesses marry. We're doing that kind of stuff. They were little. At some point, like a year later, they said, like my older one, Lizzie, just said, Lizzie goes here now. She's a senior. She said, enough. You've told us this so many times. Okay, well, you can't say it enough. But I really got that parenting, critical parenting message and lesson from working on this initiative. That's something I learned. And that's the thing about working. When the old and the young mash it up together, we create something neither could make alone. And that's what happens. So you have to commit to that. And when you do, you're lucky. If you're older, because you get to learn, you get to grow. In terms of more like practical lessons for change making, I just think if you just know what you want, because if you want to make change, you have to work with the institution through a process. A process will have more legitimacy than simply a reaction. A process will actually make something important like this stand the test of time. We're able to have the support of our alums, of the Jesuit community, of some in the Catholic Church, I think, and certainly of the staff and faculty and students at the institution, because we had a process that was careful enough so it didn't look like we were somehow just shortcutting really hearing authentic points of view and then like coming out with the answer to keep everybody quiet. A genuine process. It takes more time, yes, but it's worth it because a genuine, authentic, legitimate process allows the roots to go deep.
That's really deep.
That keeps the tree up.
That does keep the tree up.
Yeah.
Is it time for the...
Do Q&A. I'm going to invite someone up for a reflection. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Whatever.
This is the center's event.
So I'm going to invite up Angela Mass to give us short reflection, and then please stay for Q&A, all right?
All right. First, I'd like to thank Shiva and the LGBTQ Resource Center for having me here. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Chatelain and Dr. Porterfield for being here and having this really important conversation. And I think a lot of things that you mentioned resonated with me as a student activist. And particularly, Dr. Chatelain, when you mentioned students becoming unpaid consultants for the university, I think that definitely resonated with a lot of people in the room, as we could tell from the many snaps. And I think that the reason students feel that way is when the institution is not proactively doing the work and including students in the conversation as partners, it can feel a little bit exploitative. And I think that I'm not the only one who sometimes feels that way. But in addition to that, some of the things you mentioned, one thing that resonated with me a lot was that if tradition doesn't move, it becomes a problem. And I think that that's definitely true. And that's something that I'll be speaking to a little bit here. So thank you again for being here and having this great conversation. So I'm going to launch into my formal reflection. So as I entered my senior year this fall, I found myself reflecting on my time in college and what has made my experience at Georgetown salient. Frankly, it's not the rigorous academics, location in the wonderful city of Washington, D.C., Jesuit values, or even the fantastic faculty. The most important part of my college experience has been engagement and meaningful activism to improve this institution and the experiences of the people who are part of the Georgetown community. My first step on this path at Georgetown was FOSI, the pre-orientation program run through the Center for Social Justice. I made many of my closest friends through FOSI, who themselves have gone on to be incredible student leaders. During FOSI, we watched Living Wage 101, a film made by students in the Georgetown Solidarity Committee documenting their battle to make a living wage for Georgetown workers a reality. I was awestruck by what these students were able to accomplish and dazzled by their organizing skills. To be honest, I was also wondering when they actually did their homework and went to class. I'd like to steal some of those secrets. The students in that film looked like superheroes, courageous and fearless, and always exactly sure of what their next step would be. Unsurprisingly, student activism in reality is rarely as seamless as my perception of the Living Wage campaign was. This work isn't easy by its very nature, because it involves challenging the institutions and systems under which we exist. It is complicated and sometimes hindered by everything that comes with life, and student life in particular: class, work, social life. Among student activists, there are sometimes disagreements about priorities, goals, and tactics, clashing of leadership styles and personal relationships. Activism on a college campus is especially complicated by the fact that, for so many of us, the work we do is deeply personal. We see a need among our friends, our peers, our community. We witness pain. We feel that pain ourselves. Taking action is a way to channel our collective pain, anger, or frustration. It is a way of seeking justice for our communities and a way of healing. But this need for justice and healing is not often understood. In the past month, right here in DC, we have heard activists share their personal stories of trauma and in turn be called loudmouths, angry mobs, and insolent troublemakers by those in power. So how do we do activism work on this campus in this moment? Above all, I have found are two factors that contribute to activist work that facilitates enduring change: a justice-oriented cause and a belief in the ability of your institution to change for the better. But this cannot be simply on students. That's why we're all here today, to talk about that. Positive change requires institutional accountability and transparency. It requires the acknowledgement that students know what we need and what needs to be changed. Students must be trusted and genuinely listened to. Student activists must be respected as members of this community who are fighting to make it better, not punished for standing up for what we believe in. Finally, every member of the campus community must recognize that the work is never finished, and Dr. Porterfield alluded to that a little bit. The greatest joy of being on this campus, for me, is its dynamic nature. Every day we experience learning, growth, and transformation. Change is embedded within this institution, in all institutions. And in order to realize our vision of a truly justice-oriented Georgetown, we must embrace that change with open arms. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dan and Marcia, and thank you, Angela, for that wonderful reflection. So we do have time for Q&A, and then there is dinner. So if people want to do Q&A, there are mics being passed around. So if you can raise your hand.
Hi, my name is Jade. I'm a freshman in SFS. So my question is, considering the current politicized climate that we live in today, obviously we still reside in a very pertinent culture of homophobia, racism, and institutionalized aggression. So I would say, to what extent do you believe that individuals should be held accountable for their ignorance? Or to what extent do you think some of the blame should be placed on the customs, the family, the background, and the culture they inherited or were born into?
Yeah. I think we all are responsible for our beliefs and our opinions, and that if a person holds a view that should be, you think you would disagree with, or you think is unjust or prejudiced in some way, you have to decide you want to confront that person, which isn't your job, but do you want to? Or do you say, that's not my problem, I'm not going to worry about that person, because you can't worry about every person. But I do think that most people should take responsibility for their views. And just saying that culture made of you is not good enough. I also think that the conversation on a college campus is probably in many respects more easily had than in many other parts of society. And that is part of your opportunity as students to engage with people across the supposed lines of difference and find out what you have in common, what you might agree with. And it gets harder when you're out in life later to have that richness of background, which includes engagement with ideas that may be wrong-headed from your point of view or my point of view, or even offensive. But I don't want to tell people it's your job to convert other people either. You have to decide what you want to do. It's a good time, though. It's hard. It's hard to engage some of these conversations around deeply held beliefs, and many of which we all hold that maybe are mistaken or need to be clarified. But if you don't take the effort, you won't know how it feels, perhaps, to engage with someone who you think you disagree with profoundly, only to find maybe you disagree somewhat. It's a great question. If you're only a first-year student asking that kind of question, Lord knows what's going to happen when you write your thesis.
Can I say something real quick?
Yeah.
I just want to acknowledge, as we celebrate this 10-year anniversary, we're also 20 years from the death of Matthew Shepard, and the ability I think it was interesting to talk about a hate crime animating this process. Yeah. And I just remember how much that hate crime animated a process in my undergraduate years at the University of Missouri, and the bravery of people in 1998 to come out, to speak out against hate crimes, and to push institutions is something that I feel just particularly fortunate to have witnessed and unfolded in my own education.
What's funny, I just thought of one of the differences between 1979 and 2008 today, I don't know. When I was a student here, there wasn't a lot of activism within the institution. There really wasn't. I think the WGTB, the radio station, was sold for $1. And the students who were into the radio station were mad. And there was pot banging around that. I remember that vividly. But I don't remember a lot of other protests. I don't think there was a ton. It was interesting. The student body president, Monica Medina, led a campaign incredibly prescient and just for women's soccer, which was not an NCAA sport at the time. So I remember those two things. But a lot of our activism was out in society, out in DC. It was during those years we created, for example, the After School Kids program and the DC Schools Project, still here 30-some years later. And this is maybe the time, I don't know, maybe it's not more inward at Georgetown today and less outward, but I do think outward is really important. I do think looking out at things like gun violence and immigration policy and absolutely the discrimination that many people experience in the workplace is important fodder for campus conversation and even activism.
I think it's happening like a revolving door.
Yeah.
Students are making the connection.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Monroe. I work at the Center for Social Justice here on campus. So if you want to get involved with any of those issues, please come talk to me at the reception. I'd be happy to find you a way to get involved. I had a question related to long-term impact. You spoke about how students can invest in endowed opportunities to continue something, right? That's one of the ways that they can have a lot of impact.
Yeah, I think it's hard to give an endowment gift when you're just a student.
Sure.
But as you get older, you can start to invest in an endowment. My wife and I finally have make enough money that we have created an endowed scholarship at Franklin and Marshall College for financial aid, which is my way to say thank you to the school for giving us the chance to join. And so I do think that's a great goal. And I'm not going to die until I get an endowed scholarship at Georgetown University too for financial aid. I promise you that. But if you can't do that right away, giving something is a good thing.
So I'm curious, actually, thinking also about the role of the faculty in this. I actually just read a book chapter last night about civic education and higher ed that was talking about a survey of faculty who felt disillusionment. Who had entered the academy because they were under the perception that this was the place where they could really be free thinkers and free speakers and do work in community and with others, and then enter into a tenure track position where the advice that they repeatedly receive is to keep their nose clean or not co-publish or not be out in the community because it will prevent them from tenure. So I'm just curious from, as an institution, where can we put pressure that might encourage our faculty to continue to be activists and to be encouraged to be involved in their commitments to change as well?
I'll be really honest with you. I just went to my former employer this past week for an event. I have to say that Georgetown University is one in which, as a faculty member, I never feel like pulled to keep my mouth. I mean, clearly I don't do it, but keep my mouth shut. I think that one of the things I appreciate about this environment is that as a faculty member, I feel I am respected and valued in my ability to engage in the world. What I do think becomes the challenge is that faculty who see themselves extending themselves in the service of activism need support from their colleagues to continue doing that work. So if I worked in a context where there were maybe more people who did my research area, more faculty of color, then I would have, I think, a more appropriate balance of the activism stuff and the school stuff. I think for me and many people in my generation and of my mindset about our jobs, we just feel pulled in many directions. But also, this kind of advice, like keep your mouth shut until tenure, no one ever does that. People who have no integrity before tenure will have no integrity after tenure. It's just true. It is true. And this is like, there are many ways to keep yourself fed. And I think if you're tethered to this idea of keeping your head down until you become successful, you're setting such a bad example that perhaps your gifts aren't being met by this environment.
Thank you.
Amelia?
Oh, I wasn't expecting to get it that soon.
Do you know Amelia?
My two favorite books are, the first one is, and the one that I want to talk about is Whatever It Takes, talking about Jeffrey Canada. The second one is Twilight, but that's neither here nor there. And I think that the reason why it's my favorite book is because I think Jeffrey Canada is an absolute genius. Yeah. And one of the things that you were talking about when you were talking about the talent system, is that how it's referred to as?
The talent strategy. The
talent strategy is that it puts, and this is my opinion, it puts a lot of onus on the student insofar as they need to be resilient, they need to have grit. And one of the things that I appreciate about what you did with the Krista Rain Kit program, which I attended, was that I felt like it helped me gain that grit. So I guess the purpose of the question that I'm trying to ask you is, how much of an institution's work is to bestow grit upon the student as opposed to students entering institutions such as Georgetown with that grit beforehand?
That's a good question. There's a lot of people thinking about that from the perspective of students who have experienced privilege in their whole upbringing. And so the question is, how does that student get challenged in a way that it makes them uncomfortable and pushes her or him to more growth? In terms of, I think it's a mistake to say, well, the students are gritty, so since they're gritty, they don't need anything because they're gritty. So I'm not for that, but I am for recognizing what is grit exactly. The way Duckworth defines it is she defines it as passion plus perseverance in pursuit of goals. It's quite direct thing. It's not just resilience, not just nose to the grindstone. Passion and goals are a part of it too. I like to think of it, what I call it anyway, is grit plus, by which I mean there's many other things that we need, depending on the person. Humility, exposure to the world, the opportunity to try something radically different, not a goal. So I like to think of grit plus as if for students who are proud of the grit that they have and have demonstrated, which we've seen in the admission process at F&M, to then say, what else goes with that grit to really unlock all the things you want to do? Thank you for asking.
I'm a Georgetown student, care of the brilliant senior auditor program. I'm just curious, Dr. Porterfield, if you could reflect on how you think the Georgetown LGBTQ experience was modulated by being next door to the District of Columbia, as opposed to the middle of Indiana.
Well, I'm not sure I want to even try to speak. I could be mansplaining here quickly for the LGBT experience in DC, but I would just say that DC provides a great place for students of all backgrounds to get involved, to meet other students, young adults, to be on the cutting edge of new trends, and it's valuable for students to go out into the city, experience the richness of urban life, whatever that means, and come back and carry as much of it back to the campus as they can. And in the case of DC, there's always been a very strong LGBT community here, and that, I think, provided for some of my friends, back when I was a student or when I was a younger employee working here, an outlet that the college wasn't offering. An acceptance, an inclusion, role models. And so the LGBT Center, in a sense, was catching up for a lot of work that I think the school needed to get done. And so maybe the fact that we now have it here means that we are giving something to DC and not just sending our students out to DC to get the benefits of being in DC. And if the question is, well, would it have been harder in another place than it was in DC at a Catholic institution to create an LGBT center? I don't think so, because I think that the principles on which President DeGioia grounded it was not the location of Washington, D.C., it was the love command. So that runs across all the Jesuit schools.
Hi, my name's Ali. Thank you so much for being here. I had a question about all of our favorite topic, free speech, and a university's responsibility within that. So within the liberal notion of the free expression of ideas, something this university holds dear, when should an idea not be given an institutional platform because it is fundamentally hateful? When is an idea not one that needs to be morally contended with? And in such a politicized climate, what is the responsibility of an institution to take a position on these hateful ideas? Thank you.
You want to take with that, or
You know my thing on this. Half the people in the room have already heard about this. Free speech is a great idea in a free society. We are yet to get there. This is all I'm going to say. A university is not a hotel where you just rent rooms and let anything happen. We discriminate in admissions, we discriminate in faculty hiring, we discriminate in who can enter the buildings at certain times of day. I do not understand why universities have adopted this idea that then free speech is the one place where there's no vetting of the ideas. So with that being said, I think the free speech conversation is a conversation that's deeply empty, that is often used to distract us from the fundamental inequality in which universities and other institutions are built. But with that being said.
So I guess what I think is that this is very context dependent. And so while your questions would imply there's a yes or no answer, you can define the line. I think actually it's context dependent. And when I was here, working here especially the phase I worked here from 2000, roughly 1996, 97 to 2010, 11. Some really controversial speakers came here, were invited here, were allowed to come here. That included Larry Flint, invited by students. It also included, beamed in, Muammar Gaddafi, invited by a lecture fund. And President DeGioia met with the families of people that lost relatives on the Lockerbie flight who went to Georgetown and explain to them that he was going to not give Gaddafi any rights to speak here, but give the lecture fund the right to invite speakers, even if their invitations were offensive. The right adheres to the students and the faculty. And that's pretty painful to have to do that. Put yourselves, if any of you think it's easy to be a college president, put yourself in that conversation. You've got a statement of freedom of expression. It's worked in this place for a while. And now you have that invitation from your students. What do? President Joya had to take his stand, and he did there. He was following an interesting example. And I think you'll appreciate this because Jack invoked Archbishop Romero at the beginning. And everybody here in this room, right, loves Archbishop Romero. We're all thinking, what a great saint. That's the saint I can get behind. I like that saint. Everybody's thinking that because what Archbishop Romero did was he stood up for the voiceless and he got gunned down by death squads led by a guy named Roberto D'Aubuisson while saying Mass in San Salvador. And then what Jack didn't tell you, the full extra part, was that honorary degree was the only one Georgetown's given someplace other than campus. Father Tim Healy, Jesuit priest, flew to San Salvador and gave that honorary degree. Okay? Now, 2 years later, he was shot saying Mass. D'Aubuisson had ordered the assassination. 3 years later, a group called the Young Americans for Freedom invited Roberto D'Aubuisson to speak at Georgetown. What would you do if you were Tim Healy? You gave that honorary degree to a man. You flew down to give it to him because of what he stood for. True Catholicism. He was gunned down, and it's known that D'Aubuisson, the head of the death squad security police, it's known he did it. Your students invited him. Do your students have the right to invite Roberto D'Aubuisson? I was your age, and I went to Father Healy, who taught me after he said Mass one night with a friend of mine. I said, you can't let D'Aubuisson come. I was working with all these kids from El Salvador in D.C., what's now the D.C. Schools Project. They had walked with their families, rode on the top of trains all the way through Mexico because of people like D'Aubuisson. Tim Healy, who was a Jesuit priest, looked at me and said, I respect your views, but you're wrong. I can't stand D'Aubuisson, but I'm not going to censor the students' ability to invite who they want. That is their right. So these are hard questions. But ultimately, I think where this institution comes down is it doesn't protect the right of a D'Aubuisson to speak here. It protects your right to invite a D'Aubuisson or a Larry Flint or a Muammar Gaddafi, even though your doing so will cause harm to the institution. Because in all three cases, it did cause harm. It really did. And when we developed our speech and expression policy at Franklin and Marshall, we basically took this same approach. We did write something in, I think it's in Georgetown's. We said to the students and the faculty, you have the right to be offensive and invite somebody that offends others. That's your right. But you don't have to exercise that right. Why don't you ask people if they'll be offended? Why don't you see if maybe there's a speaker that's a middle ground between the one you think you want to invite and the people that you aren't talking to who might really think that's an offense to them? Have a conversation. It's like when you raise kids. Yeah, you have the right to be a bore to your kids. You have the right to be a bore, but do you have to be? Is that the best you can do? So there's an educational thing here too. I err on the side of more right to faculty and students, and at the same time, a challenge to be good citizens.
I guess the better question then is, how is the institution fostering an environment where the students don't invite speakers that are offensive?
Yeah. And who are those, and how are those parents fostering that respect, that interesting notion? It's a different thing, but it's interesting. Consent. Consent is a lot of things. It's interesting. If we had more of a culture focusing on teaching children consent in many ways early, maybe we would have less impulsiveness, less stick a finger in your eye, more let me talk to you behavior from people. Thank you for asking that.
Last question, and then,
Is this on? Is it on? It's on.
We can hear you.
Okay. I can't hear myself. Okay, so I guess now thinking of all the questions that have been asked, I'm hoping that this is a little bit cohesive, but I had been thinking while you were speaking, first of all, the recent issue in Michigan, at the University of Michigan, with the letters of recommendations being rescinded based on political views and personal attitudes towards certain policies, and I was wondering how that fits into this micro relationship between faculty and students and expressing your own views and identities. And then thinking about, there was also the other incident of a graduate student discussing LGBTQ issues in her TA class and then feeling that the university had censored her and whether or not that lawsuit was valid. So I was thinking about those two particular instances. In general terms of, you described the student population here as the ages of 18 to 22, but I am here as a representative of the graduate student population, which is the largest student body population on this campus. And I was wondering, thinking about the legacy of the LGBTQ Resource Center and the broad graduate population at the university, what the center is doing to maybe encompass that population that is so diverse and dealing with a lot of different circumstances, not living on campus often, most of the time, having different careers, having being in completely different stages of life, but still perhaps interested in fostering a community and interested in participating in activism, not only on campus, but around the city.
Would you be okay if we divided up your question?
Sorry.
No, there's 3 questions. You could answer the grad school question, Shiva, or how you think about it. You could answer whatever you want, but I was thinking you could handle the classroom one, and I could handle the letter of recommendation one.
I'd like a plan. I like having a plan.
So I'll just say, I think a professor's job is to support the aspirations of students, and so. Not to tell students, I'll help you with this, but not with that. Now, if a student asks for a recommendation from me for something that they're really not qualified for, I will tell them that. Or if my letter would not help them because I'm not an expert in biochemistry and this is a grad school biochemistry, I'll tell them that. I might still write the letter if they just tell them this letter is not going to be the strongest letter I could write for this reason. I've done that many times. I know, I'm getting there. But I would never tell a student, you're applying for Teach for America. I don't like Teach for America. Teach for America is hostile to long-term careers in teaching. People say this all around the country. Your example has to do with Israel, but the Teach for America one has been everywhere. I don't think that's right. Would I try to punish an adult? Probably not. But do I respect that? No. No, I don't respect it. I don't respect an adult that tells a student, I'm not going to support you because I don't like the thing you want to do. I don't respect that. Would I punish it? No.
2 things that I want to say, because I think that this raises some really important questions about how we frame the relationship. And so people will talk to me and say, well, I try to be a blank slate in the classroom and people don't know my views. And I don't have that luxury, one, because I never shut up, so people have very clear, there's a whole thing on the internet about my feelings about things. But second, as a woman of color in the classroom, students are already imagining things about me that may be true or not. Right? So in order for me to not be a caricature of whatever they imagine, I have to be transparent about the fact that my intellectual work has led me down a journey to a set of conclusions. And that my job in the classroom is to show why that intellectual journey is so exciting, that you devote your years in graduate school to it, and that it is a process. I think the way that faculty get themselves hemmed up is they do this blank slate thing, and then students don't quite get why they're there. Or they do this kind of sick thing that I think contributes to a culture of harassment and abuse, where they want to be everyone's hero, good object, and they do creepy manipulative stuff to a group of people who are learning from them. And so if you enter my classroom, you've probably heard or found out my position on something. But in that space that's so sacred and special, I'm going to tell you about the journey I went on to come to these conclusions that are so important to me that I make them real in the classroom and try to do them in the outside world. So I think that that comes with a level of maturity and mentorship through teaching that sometimes we don't get in that kind of, that in that space of graduate training that I really try to be an advocate for. But I think that this issue about the letter of recommendation, I do think this. I think that it is our responsibility to help students achieve their goals, but I think it's also important for us to have very clear conversations about some of the questions that their goals can raise. Whether it's the student who says, I don't know what I want to do, so I'm going to go to law school, and some of you should feel indicted by that comment because I hear it from students all the time, right? I don't know what I'm going to do. I feel like I have a responsibility to say, okay, what do you want to learn in this stage of your life? And the Teach for America example is a really potent one among my friends. And before I will write a letter for any type of teaching thing, I'll say, are you actually good at teaching? Because I'm more offended by the idea of someone who's not good at teaching becoming a teacher, as well as some of my questions about the model for Teach for America. It's that radical transparency that Dan talked about at the beginning that is also not just important for institutions, it's important for people who can be somewhat of influence in the lives of someone who's learning. And I think that this is where we get into a lot of these problems.
And to your question about grad students, we do work with graduate students. But it is a question of capacity and what we can do. So I'm happy to talk to you more about that. But we do work with graduate students. It's just, we are a tiny office. And we try our best to work, we facilitate a lot for graduate students across 3 campuses. So happy to chat more, yeah. And I think with that, dinner is being served next door at Herman Room. But if you will join me in giving them another round of applause.